Hello, everyone. Here is your Bible lesson for Wednesday, April 8th. We are going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 9. I'm probably going to do chapter 9 and chapter 10 today, depending on how long I spend in chapter 9, but I think we'll be able to get through both chapters. All right, let's get into it. If you remember, the last chapter was. What happened in the last chapter? He was just having a bunch of different conquests. Yes. So David's been having a lot of different success. In these chapters, as we know, God was blessing David on all his military battles, and he's beating these people and those people and these people. He beat the Moabites, and everything like that. He seems to have a real vendetta, by the way, against the Moabites. We don't really know why. We do know that he at one point had told the Moabites before Saul, while Saul was still going after him, he asked the Moabites to take care of his parents and sent his parents to go live with the Moabites, and we don't ever hear from his parents again. Some people think that might mean that they did something to his parents, maybe killed them or something like that, and this is why he takes so much vengeance on the Moabites. We don't know that for sure. We just know he's pretty rough with the Moabites. But you also, I want to remember back to 2 Samuel 4 for what we're going to talk about in a second. Now, David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul?" This is verse 1 of chapter 9, verse 1. "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness to him for Jonathan's sake?" So he's sitting around. This is a while. As we know, years are passing, and David's having more and more and more success. So much of what a king does is trying to protect his kingdom and beat enemies, but David has so much success that he has less of that to worry about. And so at one time, who knows why? Maybe he's just sitting around the house and doing things, and you know how your mind wanders sometimes. And if there's somebody that's precious to you, your mind will definitely wander to them at times. You know, if you have a loved one who's not with you anymore, your mind during those times of silence or those moments of pause, you might think of them. And in these moments, one of these moments, he's thinking of Jonathan, and his mind goes to Jonathan. He thinks about his buddy. Remember the last time we met that we talked about them? It was like 1 Samuel 20 or something. And Jonathan and David were making a covenant, and Jonathan was like, someday you're going to be King David, and I'm going to be right by your side, and I will be your best friend and help you lead and do whatever you need me to do, and I'll be rooting for you the whole way. And they had this picture of David being the king and Jonathan being right there by his side, best friend the whole way. And Jonathan was killed in battle. And so David's really sad. And he's just thinking about him. And he asked one of the servants, hey, do you guys know of anybody left in the house of Jonathan, like any of Jonathan's relatives, that I can show kindness to them? I want to do something nice for them. And so they say, well, we don't know of any people from the house of Jonathan, but we do know that there's a servant of Saul who's still alive who might know. And so in verse 2, they were serving in the house of Saul. His name was Ziba, and they called him. He used to work for Saul. He was one of Saul's servants, where when Saul was alive, it was a very prestigious position because Saul, being king, had a lot of land and everything, and Ziba was his head servant. It was probably a very good position for him to be in. Even though he was a servant, it was still a respectable position and a respectable household, probably a lot better than he's doing right now. And so David calls for him, and he came to him, and he said, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, and it's funny, he says in verse 2, "At your service." You can picture him being like, "Yes, sir, at your service." Maybe he's trying to impress David. Maybe he's looking for a position to be a servant in David's household. I don't know. But David asks him, "Ziba, I have a question for you. Is there not still someone in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And so he asked him, "Is there anybody left in the house of Saul? I want to do something nice for them. Do you know of anybody left?" And Ziba says to the king, "Well, there's still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet." Now, if you guys remember back in 2 Samuel chapter 4, they had mentioned just randomly, and it was like such a random little, now just to let you know, thing about a boy named Mephibosheth, or when he was a boy. His nurse was carrying him the day that Saul died and Jonathan died. His nurse was rushing out of the room, carrying him, and dropped him, and he became lame in both feet, whether it be that he broke his legs or whatever, and they healed wrong. He can't really walk right now. Or if he can walk, very, very minimally. He's lame in his legs. which means he has difficulty walking or he can't walk at all. And so now what David is doing right now and inquiring about this is very atypical. It's not very what happens with kings usually in those days. It was very customary for kings to seek out the seeking out of anybody that was related to Saul. It makes sense. But what they would do is they would seek them out and kill them, because in those days a king would look at, like, if somebody took over, he would look at anybody from that king's family as a possible rival. So he would seek out anybody from that king's family, and he would murder them. It was very well known. It was what everybody did. It was the custom of that day. If you have a revolution and take over as king, what you do is you kill the king's entire family, just wipe them all out. And so what had happened was nobody knew about Mephibosheth because he was in hiding. He had been in hiding since he was a little kid, and years and years have passed, and since then, and probably, I don't even know how many years, but years and years have passed since then, and he's been in hiding the whole time because he's worried. As he doesn't really know David. He was a little kid when it happened, and all he knows is that somebody else took over the throne, and his uncle Ishbosheth was fighting against David for a while, and Ishbosheth ended up getting murdered by somebody, and now David took over all of Israel, and that's all he knows. He doesn't know what David wants, doesn't know anything about David, so he's in hiding for his life. And so Ziba mentions Mephibosheth to the king, and so David says, "Where is he?" And Ziba says, "Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodebar." And so he's in this city called Lodebar, and so David sends for him. And so you can picture. You always put yourself in the story. Picture being Mephibosheth. One day, just a day like any other, he hears a knock at the door, and he's always a little bit nervous of knocks at the door, and he goes and he opens the door and he sees it's the king's servants, and they say, "Are you Mephibosheth?" And he's like, "Yes. The king wants to see you. We're here to bring you to the king." And it'll be frightening. It'll be absolutely frightening. He doesn't know what David's intentions are. He's like, is this the day? Is this the day that I get killed? And so he's brought to the king, and he's brought there, came to David. The first thing he does is falls on his face before the king in a very humble position. And because his whole idea is, maybe I can just beg for my life. Maybe the king might let me escape with my life because I'm as good as dead right now. The king's going to kill me. Maybe I have a slight chance of living. And so he says, "Are you Mephibosheth?" And he's like, falls on his face and said, "Here is your servant. I'm your servant." And he's like saying all this stuff like, "Yeah, yes, sir. I'm going to serve the king." He's trying to show him that he is not a threat. He's just saying, "I'm your servant." And David says to him, "Do not fear." And whenever, by the way, you hear somebody say, "Do not fear," it means that they're afraid, right? He says, "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake. And I will," and so he eases some of his fear, saying, "Don't worry, I'm not here to kill you. I'm going to show you kindness because I love Jonathan so much. He was my best friend. And for his sake, I'm going to show you kindness." And not only was he saying these words, but he actually says specifically how he's going to do that. He goes, "I'm going to restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather." And so he restores from this huge, huge portion of land, which was an unbelievably big blessing. Saul being king would have had a large portion of land, and it would have been split between Saul's 4 sons, but now Saul doesn't have any sons left. So it all goes to Mephibosheth, who has had nothing. And now he gets this huge plot of land. He said, "You shall eat bread at my table continually." So he said, from now on, obviously if anybody eats, the king's going to eat. The king has the best food in the whole nation. And he goes, "You're going to eat food at my table. You're going to be a member of," you can picture a kingly palace with a big long table or whatever. He goes, "You're going to eat here. You have a spot open any day. There's a feast every night. You're going to have a spot open at dinner every single day. You're going to eat here. You're going to eat the good stuff with me every single day." And so you can picture the difference between what Mephibosheth thought was going to happen, which was he gets brought in and David goes, "You are going to be put to death," and he gets slaughtered, versus what actually happened, where David's like, "I'm going to give you a bunch of land. and you're going to and I'm gonna let you eat at my table. It would almost be like you get a tap on the shoulder, and you go yeah, and the teacher goes, you, the principal wants to see you, and you go, oh no, I'm gonna get in trouble. Oh, they found out something I did that was wrong, that was bad, and you get sent, and you're taking a long walk to the principal's office, and you go in, and Mr. Hanlon's there, and he says, sit down, and so you sit down, and you're like, oh boy, I'm gonna get in so much trouble. Oh, when your heart's beating, and I don't know if you ever get this way, but if I'm ever really nervous, I get like, it feels like this like burning comes up from my stomach up into my chest, and I'm like, oh. And so I don't know if that ever happens to you, and you get that feeling, and all of a sudden he goes, all right, listen, I would like to give you $5,000 because you're just such a great kid. You'd be like, what? Are you kidding me? So you go there thinking you're going to detention or get in trouble or something like that, and he goes, we're going to give you $5,000 just for being awesome. And it'd be like, oh, great, this is completely different than I expected. And so that would obviously never happen, but, imagine the difference with what's happening with Mephibosheth. And so he says all these things, and in verse 8, he bows down, he says, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? And so he's just showing how grateful he is and how he feels like he's not worthy. And the king called Ziba, this person who had been servant of Saul's household, and said to him, I've given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and all his household. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your father's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So, and Ziba said to the king, according to all that the Lord the king has commanded his servant, so your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat my table like one of the king's sons. So he says this to Ziba, and I imagine, I don't really know for sure, but I imagine this was a very good thing for Ziba to do, because Ziba, I imagine this was a step up from whatever life he was living at that point in time. And so now Ziba is now in charge of what used to be the king's land. And so the king, King Saul's land back in the day. And so now he's in charge of this whole estate, essentially, and which would be a very good position for him as a servant to do. And so Mephibosheth dwells in Jerusalem, and this is a very happy end of the 9th chapter, but we're going to go on to the 10th chapter here. And it says in chapter 10, and by the way, our story of Mephibosheth is not done, unfortunately, but we're ending this portion with a nice happy ending. So it was sad before when he was lame on his feet. Now it's happy that he's eating at the king's table. But we're not done with Mephibosheth. Chapter 10. And it happened after this that the king of the people of Ammon died, and Hanun his son reigned in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness for me. And so he gets this. He hears about this guy in Ammon who dies, this king, and so evidently this king was nice to David. I don't really know. We know that Hiram, king of Tyre, was really nice when he gave him all those cedar trees. I guess the king of Ammon, Nahash, was kind to David at that point as well. And so he was kind to David. He dies, and his son takes over. And David has compassion on his son because he's like, I know what it's like for a father figure to die. He thought of Saul as a father figure, and he died. Maybe his own father died. We're not really sure. We don't hear anything about Jesse at all, especially since David's the youngest at this point in time. Jesse might have even died of old age by this point in time, even if he wasn't actually killed. And so David's a very empathetic person. Do you know what empathy means? Empathy and sympathy are two different things. Pathos means feelings, and so it has the word pathos in it. Sympathy means I feel bad for you. Okay, like I can see something that's happening to you, and I can see that it stinks, so I feel bad. It stinks that you feel bad. Empathy is I feel what you feel. And that's even more than sympathy, because like you're sad and it's making me sad seeing you sad. I'm thinking of all the stuff that you're going through, and I'm actually on the same wavelength as you, and I'm connecting with your feelings. And David was very, very much like that. He had an amazing capacity for compassion and on other people, and he hated the situation with like Nabal and Abigail, where he was going to go take vengeance on Nabal. That's a rarity for David. Usually David just feels really bad and cares for people. And so he sees this guy, Hanun, his dad dies, and now he's the new king, and he feels for him. He said, I want to do something for him. I feel bad. Like people would send flowers nowadays or whatever. He wants to send something to him, so he sends his servants and he sends it with his servants to Ammon and to get this kid Hanun and express his grievances. However, when the servants get there, the princes of the people of Ammon said to Hanun their lord, "Do you think that David really honors your father because he has sent comforters to you? Has David not rather sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and overthrow it?" And so these guys were like council members of the king of Ammon. And what we know about council members in the Bible, what we see, is they either give really great advice sometimes, and sometimes they give really horrible advice. This is one of the situations they give horrible advice. So they say to this new king, this young king, who again, young people are often just very easily influenced by the worst counsel. They tell this young king, "Oh, David sent messengers here to express their grievances, huh? Yeah, I bet they were just here to spy out the land. You know how David has conquered Moab and he's fought so many people? I bet they're just here to spy out the land." He's like, "Oh man, well, what should we do?" And so they tell him what they think they should do. You gotta show him who's boss. Show David who's boss. And so what they did was they shaved off half their beards and cut their garments in the middle and sent them away, which means basically that they cut their garments so that they were essentially naked in the back. And it was basically a huge insult to these men. These men had, and you might not think it's a big deal, but having half of their beard shaved, first of all, they looked silly, but secondly, it was like in the ancient days, especially in like Middle Eastern and Eastern cultures, the beard was an extremely important part of like your honor. Like, it'd be like somebody shaving a skunk stripe down the middle of your head. It would be really embarrassing for you, but way more so. Like a man's beard was like, it showed that he was somebody. Because people that weren't allowed to have beards were like slaves. Like slaves weren't allowed to have beards. So if you had a shaved face in ancient society, it was a very bad look. Like people would look at you, like look down on you. And so to do this to these men was extremely insulting. And by way of insulting them, it was insulting the king. It was like a slap in the face to David, kind of like what Nabal did before, where it was like he really insulted David. And so they come and they come back, or at least they send word to David. When they told David, he sent to meet them because the men were greatly ashamed. And so notice what he does here. He actually comes and meets them. Okay, he hears what happens to them, and he actually physically goes and meets them, and shows, remember, empathy. He feels really bad for these guys, and he feels awful for them, and he says to them, because the men, and it says in verse 5, they were greatly ashamed. They were ashamed, absolutely embarrassed and ashamed, probably to the point of tears. These grown men, and David says to them, "Wait at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then you can return." Obviously, he gave them new clothes. But he tells them, "Don't worry about your beards. Just wait here until your beards grow back, and then you can." And David Guzik brought up a great point. Is that he said David could have used them, like brought them up in front of everybody. Look at these guys. Look at how they shave their beards, just to get everybody motivated. No, I'm angry. How could they do that? But he cared for the guys. He knew that would embarrass them more. He wanted to keep it hush hush and make sure they weren't embarrassed by it. He could have used it to like drum up some support, but instead he said he just cared about them individually. He said, "Just stay here, wait till your beards, don't worry about it." And he just announced, "We're going to war with Ammon." And so he decides to go to war with Ammon. And in verse 6, the people of Ammon saw, "Oh, here comes David. He's going to fight against us. We need some help." And so they go and hire the Syrians. So they have Ammon and the Syrians, and this is something that was pretty common in those days. You're going to see it happen in the First and Second Kings quite frequently. You could hire another nation's army to be your army as well, and they would go in battle with you. They would go with you into battle, and so they hire the Syrians to come with them in battle, and so it's Ammon and Syria against David. And when David heard of it, verse 7, he sends Joab and all the army of the mighty men. He doesn't go himself, but he sends Joab to go fight. And the people of Ammon, verse 8. So the people of Ammon, I'm going to summarize for the rest of this chapter. Essentially, Ammon comes on one side and the Syrians come on another. And Joab has this really great battle strategy. He doesn't ever give up. You can see one thing about Joab is he's very courageous. He's very tough, very strong in battle. He's not scared. He is not a scared guy in battle. He likes violence a little too much, which we talked about before. He likes vengeance, but he is very bold. Boldness is his strength. His weakness is he does not have the compassion. He does not have the empathy, but his strength is his boldness. But so he says to the men, let's split up. I'm going to fight one way, and you guys fight the other way. I'm going to fight the Syrians with my people. And he put his brother Abishai in command of the other half of the army. He goes, we'll just split up and we'll fight either way, and we will just do our best. And if one of us is losing, then the other can come help. We're just going to fight to the death. And so he goes and fights against them, and Joab and his people just drew near to the Syrians, and in a strong way. And the Syrians were intimidated. They were like, "No, we're out. We're done. Yep, no thanks." And so the Syrians actually fled before Joab to kind of retreat and regroup. And then when the people of Ammon saw the Syrians fleeing, they're like, "Wait a minute, they're fleeing." And then they're like, the other part of the army, Joab and his part of the army, are going to turn around and start to fight us. And so instead of us fighting just Abishai and his part of the army, so they said, forget it. And they said, we're out of here too. And so they they fled before Abishai and they entered the city. And so, but the Syrians actually regrouped and gathered together. And Hadadezer, whoever this guy is, some guy sent and brought out another group of Syrians and made this super army of all the Syrians. And so they are gathering together to fight the people of Ammon. And David was told that was happening. And so David said, all right, they need my help. And David goes and comes himself to battle this time and fought with them. And because David was there, he kind of inspired them more. And they went and they beat the Syrians and had this great, great victory. So that's chapter 10. But I want you to notice something. Notice what David tried to do. David tried to kind of just hand off the responsibility, which is the first little bit of concern. We've seen in the last two chapters, David has a little bit more time on his hands. We see in chapter 9, there's nothing wrong with what happened, but he was just kind of having some time to himself and being like, you know what, I'm thinking of Jonathan. I wonder if there's anybody for the house. He just has time to think about these things. And, in one of the chapters beforehand, he was like, you know what, let me make God a house. And he has time to think about these things. And in chapter 10, we see him do something kind of out of his character. Usually he's a leader, but he says, I'm going to kind of stay back. Joab, why don't you take the men and fight the Syrians? And it doesn't really work out that well. He ends up going, you know what, I'll join the battle. But we see him have the first sign of being like, you know what, maybe I'll just stay out. Maybe I'll just kind of hang back on this one. And we're going to see he decides to do that in chapter 11, and it leads to something really, really bad. You see, we're going to talk about it tomorrow, is that apathy. Apathy is a word. Being apathetic is a big word. What it means is kind of being like, whatever, who knows, and just being like, I'll just roll with the punches. I'll just kind of go with the flow. And it can lead to really, really tough times because, we learned in history that, I was talking to you in history about Constantinople when he made being a Christian legal. Before that point in time, Christians were persecuted, and it was awful and terrible. Lots of Christians lost their lives, but Christianity spread like wildfire. Because of the persecution, it was like, you're either a Christian or you're not. You need to make the decision. And people who said, I'm going to be a Christian, were strong and were willing to die for it. And were like, you couldn't just pretend to be a Christian. Nobody would do that because you'd a good chance you would die. And so being a Christian meant you were all in. everything. It wasn't just like, yeah, I guess I'll be a Christian a little bit on Sundays or something. But once Christianity was legalized, it began to be like, yeah, I'm kind of a Christian, but I'm going to kind of go with what the world says as well. So we're going to see that apathy is bad for David as well. Next chapter, big important chapter in 2 Samuel. But all right, guys, have a good day.